There we are. Welcome everyone. Over to Judy.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for being here or there. And again, thank you for your loyalty. Very much appreciated.
Printed ones?
Sorry, Martin and I decided which notes I'm going to use, whether I'm going to use my written notes or
Well, you should
Mar-
change your life. I'm sorry,
Martin's lovely.
you normally use those.
Yeah.
Oh, she's in a mood this morning, ladies and
No,
gentlemen.
I'm not in a mood. Just to explain, first of all, I'm still slightly in shock that I need another operation. Under cover of these trapped nerves, apparently my right hip had been deteriorating, which I did not realise. So it was a bit of a surprise to be told that I got an arthritic hip and that it was bad enough to be operated on. So I have got a date now, which is the 17th of September this year, which is wonderful. And I'm not going to the Spires this time. I'm going to the Royal Orthopaedic. The same surgeon, the same surgeon that does it, works at 3 hospitals. So that will be, hopefully not too disruptive. I hope I'm going to make a good recovery. And I also need to explain about next year. I said we do the fall of the Roman Empire, which is when that's where most people start modern European and British history. The fall of the Roman Empire, and then the Saxons coming, of course, and the Saxon kingdoms. But I'm thinking, to say to Martin, concentrating more on people, on how people influence, fame, not just famous people, but other people, influence the course of history. And just to explain, when national curriculum was introduced, which is a bit of a shock to most history teachers, there were aspects of it which we had never really considered, even though we got degrees in history. We spent 3 years getting a degree. And the different aspects were causation, what causes things to happen historically and in other ways, causation, long-term and short-term, explaining that to children, getting them to understand what causes something, usually multi-causal, something happens. Then the role of the chronology, which kind of teaches itself. You can't really teach chronology. It just, if you teach in a chronological way, then the children will understand what chronology is, hopefully. The role of the individual, which had been very much the Victorian way of teaching history, famous people, but then had become less popular, in fact, very unpopular. And it was kind of resurrected because it become so unpopular, it was becoming quite neglected and not considered. So bring back the individual. Then children had to learn the difference between fact and opinion, which is actually quite tricky. They'd also got to be able to recognize bias. And people are writing something with a partisan attitude, which was very interesting, but again, quite tricky. So what I was thinking was, we choose the one about the individuals and do it that way, rather than lots of facts and lots of developments and so on, but do that, but through individuals, through people who made a contribution, because that is a valid form of teaching history. So I'll leave that with you. If anybody's got strong opinions, I think that's a really rubbish idea. I need to sort of say, that sounds awful, don't want to do that. It's not a different, well, it is a different way of teaching history, but it's an interesting way of teaching history through what was called national curriculum, the role of the individual.
And we'll start with 2 Zoom meetings, one on the 5th of September and one on the 12th.
Yeah, one on the 5th, Zoom, and then on the 12th.
That's just a week apart.
Zoom again, and then I'll have my, hopefully, have my operation on the
Have your
17th
short break.
and then start to recover, hopefully.
Good.
So, the reign of George V, which was a long reign, 1910 to 1936. First World War. I think we all know a lot about the First World War for all sorts of reasons. The assassination, we all know, began the war, but it had been building up for a long time. It wasn't a sudden shock. Some people have taught it as or believe that it came from nowhere. You know, all of a sudden there was this war. Well, it had been building up, and people had actually been flagging up the possibility of a European war for quite a long time. But most people had ignored that because it's something they didn't want to think about. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was significant because he was actually the heir to the Austrian Habsburg Empire. His wife, Sophie, a morganatic marriage, she wasn't considered sufficiently royal to be his consort, but they were a very happily married couple. He was assassinated in July, well, they were both assassinated in July 1914. And this led by degrees, like a sort of awful game, to the escalation of the conflict. At first, from the British point of view, it wasn't very significant at all. It was just another of these Balkan assassinations. They're all violent in the Balkans. You know, we didn't have a very high opinion of people in the Balkans. They were always killing each other and fighting, and it was on the inside pages of our papers. It wasn't considered that important, which is fascinating, really, when you think what it led to. But because of the two armed camp situation, which we've talked about, Europe was in a warlike situation with these great alliances that had been built up over the preceding years. Now, the assassin, Gavril Princip, was a student. He was only 19 years old, and he was a Serb. Although the assassination took place in Sarajevo, the assassins, and it was a group of them, had travelled there from Serbia. So Austria, of course, demanded an apology and an apology from Serbia, because the assassins were Serbian. And Serbia refused. No, we're not going to apologise. I mean, their attitude was, well, you know, these are students. You know, these are, how are we supposed to control everybody in our country? You know, as a government, we're not going to apologise. Russia had always supported people of the same religious persuasion, Orthodox, and the Serbs were what we now call Russian Orthodox. So Russia came in on Serbia's side and threatened reprisals. Austria then, so it's Austria versus Russia. Germany came in into the dispute supporting Austria-Hungary. France then offered support to Russia because these were all treaty obligations that had been established several years earlier. Italy offered support to Germany, again, treaty obligation. And we, so the British government, decided to take a rather lofty attitude of neutrality. We wouldn't get involved. Why would we? This is a continental issue. We were the great imperial country. We didn't need to get involved in these problems. We did have treaty, an agreement with France and Russia, but it was only if they were invaded we would get involved, and they hadn't been invaded, so we were justified in saying this is really got very little to do with us. So how did we get involved? I don't know if you've heard of the Schlieffen Plan, which is the Prussian, now German, army plan. Somebody called Schlieffen had devised this idea, this plan, which was, instead of, if everything it came to invading France, instead of going across the Rhine, which was heavily fortified and had been for hundreds and hundreds of years, castles and defensive areas and encampments, instead of going straight across the Rhine into France, or the other way around, both sides of the Rhine were very heavily fortified. So the German idea was not to go that way at all, not to invade France in the obvious quickest way, but to swing north and enter France in an unexpected, from an unexpected direction via Belgium. Now, Belgium had only been a free country and a separate country since 1830. Very much set up by Palmerston. We had supported the idea of a free, independent Belgium. And we had signed a treaty of support that if ever Belgium was invaded, if ever Belgium was in trouble, they could look to Britain for support and help, military support. It was the only treaty of that kind we'd made. And it was 1830, so most people had forgotten about it, until the German army followed through this plan, and it worked extremely well. They invaded Belgium. Belgium was a neutral country, had a very small army, very small standing army, more like police really. They hardly any army at all. So Belgium was totally defeated within days. I mean, the Germans just marched in, did a great deal of damage. We've all seen photographs of Ypres in ruins. And we then, I say we, the British government, began to take a very great interest in what was going on, because we had a treaty obligation to come to the aid of Belgium if she was ever invaded. And in August, she was. And there was no question that we owed it. It was an honourable, our duty, our obligation to go to the aid of Belgium. And interestingly, all sorts of, I mean, this is typical of war, what we call propaganda. Stories began to emerge from Belgium of dreadful atrocities perpetrated by the German troops. Some of them were very exaggerated. Some were probably genuine. Nobody knows, because in those days there weren't as many investigative journalists as there are now. Field photography was in its infancy. The equipment was incredibly heavy. You couldn't just, it wasn't like a little camera like today. You had to have a big camera on a tripod and a black cloth over your head and so on. It was difficult to take photographs. There was still quite often, it took, well, not just minutes, but probably an hour to set up a photograph. So there weren't any photographs of these atrocities. There's lots and lots of stories about nuns being raped, pregnant women being, well, this is horrible, but pregnant women being sliced open and the baby being taken out and the baby being killed. These kind of atrocity stories were quite standard in Europe, that one side would hurl these accusations at the other. To make people so angry and indignant that they would then feel all right about killing their enemies. So these stories proliferated. There was a very famous cartoon of a German soldier looking with a very angry, horrible face and a bayonet, and he got a baby on the end of the bayonet and was sort of waving the baby about. I mean, just horrible, horrible. It wasn't a photograph. It was a drawing, a cartoon. No, I would say cartoon. It was a sketch. Powerful effect on the British public, on young men in particular, who'd been, the officers had been to public school, the young men had been to public school, and they had been told from when they were in prep school that their destiny was to fight for king and country if ever the need arose. And so they were eager to go to war. It sounds awful now to think that they were actually really, really enthusiastic. Couldn't wait to get on a train and get to Belgium and defend the Belgians. And other young men who hadn't been in public school had also been told in their elementary schools that we were the greatest country in the world, we've got this great empire, we've got the biggest navy in the world. We were kind of like St. George defending other countries, even though basically the government thought we should be neutral in most cases. We shouldn't certainly not get mixed up in continental wars. You know, there was something going on the continent. We were sort of superior to all that. We stood aside. This time, no, we did not stand aside. It was our duty. It was a religious, a sort of sacred obligation to help the Belgians. And in view of what the Huns, they were very quickly called the Huns instead of the Germans. Very interesting, again, a sort of propaganda move. Call them something horrible. The Huns, you'll remember, are one of the barbarian tribes involved in the fall of the Roman Empire. And they got the reputation of being spectacularly cruel and sadistic. Not really justified. Again, a lot of that was propaganda. But to call the Germans Huns instead of Germans was an interesting move. Or the Bosch, which meant cabbage heads. I didn't know that until about 2 weeks ago. When I was researching this, I just thought it was another name for German. Apparently it means cabbage head. So one, a savage nickname, well, not nickname, a savage name, Hun, and the other, contemptuous name, cabbage head, Bosch. Well, the French that sort of invented it, and then we carried on. And papers began to use the word Hun instead of German quite quickly because of these allegations, because of these horrible stories. And certainly the Germans were behaving rather like the Russians in the Ukraine. Things could be proved against them that they were behaving very badly in Belgium. Recruiting stations were set up with the speed of light. You know, our organisational skills were excellent, and in next to no time, huge queues had appeared. People who were in the regular army, wearing their uniforms and their medals if they got any, were sort of standing on a soapbox, and there was a sort of tent behind where you could sign up. It was all kind of instant, and the queues were enormous. And Martin's found some photographs of the queues at the enlisting stations and enlisting points in this country. Huge numbers of men wanting to go to Flanders, very anxious to get there quickly, do their basic training and get there, because they were told it was going to be over in weeks. And there's this sense of urgency, which again is upsetting when you think that the war dragged on for 4.5 years and was absolutely dreadful in so many ways. That young men were running to get into the queue. They were so worried that it'd all be over. And they were told, quite authoritatively, that it would be over by Christmas. So they got to hurry up and get there. This was August. All going to be over by Christmas. They needed to, they needed to go and do their bit. So there were various reasons for joining up. One of the very powerful reasons was they just wanted to go abroad. Opportunity to go abroad in those days was so limited. Most working class people never even thought of going abroad. It wasn't on their radar at all. And in fact, they never went very far from where they were born and brought up. People lived and died in the same village. Never went anywhere. So the idea of being paid to go abroad, was really exciting, an exciting prospect. Probably the only chance they'd ever have. Great adventure. So that appealed to young men who were limited in every respect, limited opportunities of doing anything exciting. The idea of having a uniform, again, you didn't have to pay for it. You got a free uniform. You could strut about and get girls to, be attractive to girls. And a gun. A lot of boys play with guns. They just hold a stick and go bang. but this was going to be a real gun and they're going to be trained to use it. So that was attractive as well. Very attractive. The idea, and they had been conditioned to be very patriotic for king and country, drummed into them, pictures of the British Empire and so on, maps showing the British Empire. You know, their heads had been filled with the idea of seeking military glory, but not invading other people's countries. We were not a militaristic people, not a militaristic nation, but the idea of defending, it was kind of honourable, defending a poor, weak country, being like St. George rising to the rescue, powerful. So patriotism and the chance to fight for a righteous cause, very attractive. A lot of young men, very idealistic. The idea of going and beating these bullies, bullying a small, helpless country, very attractive idea. And then, and again, a very practical reason, a lot of people in those days were living in the most awful conditions. Slums in the towns and cities, in the industrial areas, multi-occupation, people living in very cramped conditions, and in the countryside, large families living in small cottages. So again, the idea of having free food and free accommodation and the chance to escape from their awful cramped cottage or back to back, very attractive. So all sorts of factors leading to that huge wave of enthusiasm, and the recruiting stations being absolutely, you know, queues every day of smiling young men. The photographs showed them all waving and smiling and all happy.
Even having their own bed.
Yeah, yes, having their own bed, Marty just said. Yes, I mean, a lot of people, and I know stories about my family, you know, they're sort of 4 or even 6 people, children sleeping in a bed, head to tail like sardines. You know, how they ever got any sleep is a mystery. So yes, having their own bed, being looked after, you know, just everything, the whole package is absolutely sort of mesmerizing and exciting. And later in the war, they actually advertised the recruiting men, the people who were doing the actual recruiting, came up with another scheme when the enlisting fell off rather, PALS regiments, or sorry, PALS battalions, keeping young men together if they were feeling a bit nervous about, you know, a bit too much of an adventure, you know, meeting so many strangers when they hadn't been used to that. They lived in a small, closed, fairly closed community, promising them that they would keep them with their friends, and it would be called a PALS battalion. Again, very powerful and very attractive, and a very good selling point. So the first few weeks of the war saw traditional battles and what was called troop movement, like the Battle of Mons, where people claimed they'd seen angels, the angels of Mons. German and British troops then tried to outflank each other, so to go round the army and get to the sea and cut the idea of cutting an army off and surrounding them. And then, but that didn't work because both sides dug trenches, and people said, well, why did they have trenches? Well, because there wasn't any other way of defending yourself, of hiding. There weren't any Flanders is very flat, and sort of northern France and Belgium, well, northern France, flat farmland, you know, no fortifications, no castles, ancient castles or modern fortifications or forts or fortresses or anything. So you had to build your own defences. You had to dig into the ground. It was the only option. Both sides did this, leaving a space in between, which became known as no man's land. Didn't belong to either side. And eventually, incredibly, the trench system extended from Switzerland to the north, to the coast, the coast of northern France. Hundreds and hundreds of miles of complex trenches, some of which were so far underground that they were totally safe. Others were literally just like ditches that the men walked along, and we've all seen pictures of that. but a very, very complicated, systematic method of fighting became known as trench warfare. The first time in history, really, that had been used for such a prolonged period. And the men had to carry entrenching tools in their pack. Among all the other things they had to carry a digging tool, sort of like a small spade, an entrenching tool, in case they were asked by their commanding officer to dig another trench. And the war then became what's called static. It just came to a standstill with no great cavalry charges. It ceased to be a war of movement. It became a war of, it was static, and it was a war of attrition. And it was very much down to the artillery. It was the first, not the first war there where artillery had been so crucial, because the American Civil War is now regarded as the first war when artillery was so key. Not so much the old kind of fighting, man against man, gun against gun, and gun against men. So the casualties are absolutely colossal. The injuries, not just the deaths, but the injuries, nobody's known anything like it before, because both sides, but particularly the Germans, had developed very, state-of-the-art guns and rifles and various kinds of artillery, hand grenades, etc. It's a horrible thing to talk about, but that's what had happened with the Industrial Revolution. Guns have become incredibly sophisticated compared with how they had been. The old-fashioned cannon couldn't do that much damage. Well, the modern guns could. Shell fire, shells exploding and damaging people. So it wasn't a glamorous war. It was horrible, and conditions very quickly deteriorated. The only good thing was a lot of young men had never really had proper food. If they're working class, they really had poor quality food, and the army had promised them good food. It was one of the things that attracted them into when they were enlisting, the idea of, well, good quality food. And the army kept its promise pretty much. I mean, there were shortages every so often, but amazingly, they managed to deliver good quality food, certainly to the British, well, to both sides, and the Germans did very well as the commissariat, using a lot of tinned food or canned food. McConaughey's stew became famous. Meat nearly every day. Oh, most of these young men hardly ever saw meat. They lived on cheese, and especially if they were children of farm labourers, or they were farm labourers themselves. They hardly ever saw meat. They were dealing with meat. They were dealing with animals, but they didn't get the chance to buy it. So this was, and lots of bread and jam. They always promised it was different jam, but it turned out it nearly always plum jam. Became a joke. And when they opened the can, if it got plum jam in it, even if it said something different on the lid. But they were well fed. And a lot of young men, when they came home on leave, families were astonished that they'd grown. Literally, they'd continued to grow, which is unusual. You usually finish growing in your early 20s, or well before that. They'd grown and they got wider, and they looked really well, because at last they were getting some decent food. So that was a plus point. Lots of tea, and the delivery seemed to be. It's sort of secret, really. Nobody really talks about this kind of this side of war. How do they feed the troops? It's a whole story in itself. How are the troops actually fed? So that was one of the advantages of being in the British Army. They did keep their promise. The men were pretty well fed. So the war became static. Injuries were dreadful. Deaths, of course, the death toll was terrible. There were no glamorous cavalry charges. It became a war of attrition, trying to wear the other side down. Every so often, the men had to climb out of their trenches and run across, or walk across no man's land and try and attack the enemy trenches. And of course, they were mown down by machine guns. Rapid fire machine guns, of course, being invented. Both sides had them, but the Germans were slightly ahead because, well, industrially, they're now overtaken us, and they had got better quality weapons. So trench life was very unhealthy. The risk of shells landing nearby, men had, it was called shell shock. And there is such a thing, of course, because it disturbs the air, and men fell unconscious and sometimes died without a mark on them. They died of the explosion being so near, you know, actually landing in their trench. But shell shock was also used as an expression for or neurasthenia, men being mentally damaged by their experiences. There were rats. Men said they were as big as kittens, running about freely, bloated with food, living on the corpses. I mean, a disgusting image, because they couldn't move the corpses quickly enough because the death toll was so dramatic and so huge. You know, they did their best to remove the bodies, but the rats got there first. Lice, I think we all know about that, the problem of lice, the fact that men couldn't get, that was a problem, of course, getting water, you know, washing was the least of their problems. They couldn't get washed, so they got lice, and this caused terrible irritation and illness. Having their feet wet, the northern France is a very wet climate, rains a lot, and the water sort of went into the trenches, and the men got what's became described as trench foot, which is a form of athlete's foot, and you know, actually eating away into their flesh. So Martin's found a picture of the men having their feet inspected. There are all sorts of powders and things that were used, and recommended changing their socks, but I mean that didn't work really very well because it wasn't possible to launder their socks. So these sound petty compared with being blown up, but they're not. You know, the idea of rats running about was disgusting, and certainly having lice. The men made a joke of it. They would take their uniforms off and use candles or some kind of light to burn the lice and hear them exploding. That was quite good fun. You know, you could hear the lice going pop, 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 pop. And that's why we call, another name for lice is a chat.
A what?
A chat.
Chat.
C-H-A-T.
Oh, right.
And that's where the word chatting comes from. Men sitting around in their trenches, you know, maybe there was still a bombardment going on. Usually they waited until there wasn't. And talking, and with the candle, murdering all these lice that were driving them crazy with bites, you know, and I mean, obviously it's a health hazard, but it was just the irritation of being bitten by lice, the itching it caused. So that's where chatting comes from, killing lice. Probably wishing I hadn't told you that. Too much information. Another problem, of course, wounds that wouldn't heal because they got soil in them, or because the men couldn't get washed. You know, obviously, infections set in. Deafness. You know, if there was an explosion very, very close, then some men were made deaf. Mental health issues, obviously, was said. And it was described as shell shock. There was a belief that when a shell exploded near, either in the trench or just outside the trench, men's brains wobbled, and that's why it's called shell shock. That they were damaged mentally, and some never recovered. But it was a misnomer. There wasn't really such a thing as shell shock. That wasn't what was wrong with them. They'd got what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. But unkind people said, oh, these men who had to be invalidated out were cowards. And that is a really horrible thing to happen, that they were treated in some areas, by some doctors, they were treated as screamshankers and cowards, inventing some saying, oh, well, they're inventing the symptoms. One of the symptoms was what's called the 1,000-yard stare. Men who just stared into the middle distance and wouldn't make eye contact with anybody, just stared in a blank kind of way, the 1,000-yard stare. Other men started to walk in a funny sort of jerky way and twitch as if they had cerebral palsy, or they got facial tics, really bad facial tics. There were all sorts of symptoms of men having reached the end of their tether. They just couldn't cope with the fear, the shelling, going over the top, running across no man's land. It was all too much, but it certainly wasn't cowardice. They were invalidated out, and attempts were made to cure them. And if they did recover, then they were sent straight back to the trenches. It was a harsh era where there wasn't much understanding shown of the problems that the men were experiencing, the men in the trenches. Positive side of the trenches, comradeship. After the war, everybody emphasised that. Many of the men never really felt comfortable again at home when the war was over, or they went home on leave. They found it very difficult to talk to their families. Their family would say, what's it like? What's it like? Tell us about it. Men found they couldn't, because it was so horrible. They certainly couldn't go into detail. And they also felt that if they talked about how terrible it was, people would think that they were wimps. They would think they were, well, it's not a word that they used then, but they would think that they were moaning and they weren't being very manly. So they were very inhibited when it came to talking about the realities of the trenches. And they found that they only really felt comfortable with men who'd also experienced trench warfare. They only really felt comfortable with other people who knew what it was like. Talking to civilians was very difficult. I mean, it ruined some marriages. You know, they were so happy when the war was over, but they found they couldn't settle at home, and they certainly felt. That's why so many little clubs and societies developed. You know, whether it were men of the same platoon would meet, or men from the same battalion, or men from the same regiment, they would feel comfortable and relaxed. They could talk about it. At home, no, and not to their women folk. You know, could talk about rats and lice and things like that. It was so comradeship, and even towards the end of the war, comradeship, a feeling that that the Germans understood more than their own families. There was almost a feeling that they were sharing the same hardships and the same conditions. Mixing together of officers and lower ranks. Some people think this has been exaggerated, but there's a lot of primary source material in people's diaries indicating that there was mixing at a time when the class system was so hierarchical. It was in mostly people didn't know anybody outside their own class, didn't want to know anybody outside their own class, and certainly titled or moneyed people didn't want to know the working classes. They had servants, but they didn't know them. They were just their servants. But this was an opportunity to actually find out, you know, actually meet somebody and talk to them from a different class. And in some areas, some parts, it worked really well. The young officers were surprised to find that they had a lot in common with these working class men. And the working class men found that these officers weren't superior and they weren't snobs. You know, they were all in it together. That was the feeling. Kind of companionship, comradeship. Decent food we've already mentioned. And certainly a feeling, until the war went dragging on and on, that they were doing something good. They felt buoyed up by the fact that they were fighting in a just cause. It was a Christian endeavor. It was good against evil. But then that wore off. 4.5 years. They couldn't sustain that feeling. As the war dragged on and on, there didn't seem to be any end in sight. that high-minded, idealistic feeling definitely wore off. And the other thing, of course, in war, one of the interesting aspects of war is the rapid development of medical skills and new techniques out of sheer necessity. Amazing, amazing things were done on the field of battle, in the dressing stations, they were called, before they were taken off to a proper hospital and operated on by qualified surgeons. Amazing things were done, considering there were no antibiotics in those days. A lot of men did eventually die of infection. My mother remembered in Barnsley, where my mother and father were from, a young man being invalided out, sitting on a bentwood chair outside, when it was good, fine weather, sitting outside, and people mocking him because he appeared to be well, except his face was very pale. He'd had a flesh wound. He'd had a wound on his upper arm, which had got better, or they thought it had got better, but he didn't seem to get any energy back. He just sat there looking very miserable and pale. And then he died. And well, what's he died of? Well, he died, apparently, the district nurse said she'd had to dress this arm. It wasn't getting better. Although he was wearing he was sitting wearing his uniform, I think, so nobody could see his arm, but apparently it was oozing and weeping and bad.
Sepsis.
Yeah, so eventually he died of sepsis. But my mother said people were mocking him. They weren't exactly giving him white feathers because he had actually been in the trenches, but talking about it behind his back and saying he was a coward, and he was saying he was still ill, and there was nothing wrong with him, and why wasn't he back? And people actually shouting at him, men shouting at him, why aren't you in the war? The miners who weren't expected to go to the war because they were doing war work by getting coal out of the ground, they were shouting at him, you're a coward, why get back to the front? Horrible. And then he died, poor thing, he just sort of died horribly slowly. So bearing in mind there were no antibiotics, so it had to be very careful nursing, redressing, dressing and redressing wounds that weren't getting better. But the technology improved during the war in terms of what kind of reconstruction they could do, what kind of, the surgical skills, let's say, improved through sheer necessity. But then tragically, new technology prolonged the war, both sides trying to gain an advantage. The Germans had, for example, a Flammenwerfer, which is a flamethrower, which Martin's found a great picture of a flamethrower in action. You could burn men from a distance. So a terrifying weapon. And you could burn them in their trenches. Again, horrible idea. That you felt safe in your trench. Well, you feel safe if there was a bombardment going on, obviously, but comparatively safe in your trench. And then this flamethrower could sort of cook you in your, just awful. The British invention, and a barbed wire. The barbed wire manufacturers made a fortune. Both sides used barbed wire to protect their trenches. So one of the problems, and there was miles and miles and miles of it, different kinds of barbed wire. Very, very effective, huge rolls, huge coils of barbed wire. Man, as high as a person, even higher. So if you did get across no man's land, how were you going to get through the barbed wire? Wire cutters. People went out at night, very, very brave, went out with wire cutters and tried to make spaces in the barbed wire. In the Battle of the Somme, we bombarded the trenches and the barbed wire for a week with heavy artillery. And it turned out that it hadn't destroyed the barbed wire. The barbed wire had simply bounced up and down with the effect, the wind that it caused, all these shells, it just bounced up and down. So a lot of men actually did manage to get across no man's land, of course, to the enemy trenches, but then how would they get through the wire? And they got stuck on the wire and died there. It was just, barbed wire became an issue, let's put it that way. Miles of barbed wire used. Tanks. we've been working on these secret things, and they were called tanks because they look like great big water tanks. Nobody knew what they were really, but people said they looked like water, something to hold water, tanks. And the name stuck. They never got any other name. Something with caterpillar treads that could climb across the barbed wire and across trenches. Something that could crawl across no man's land, get to the barbed wire in front of the enemy trenches and defeat the wire. Just climb over it or squash it. Caterpillar treads. They only went at 4 miles an hour. That was the problem. So if anyone was brave enough to run up to one and pop a hand grenade in, everyone in the tank got killed. They were very primitive, although they'd been tested and had been released as ready for battle. So it was 1917 before they were used at the Battle of Cambrai. And initially they were very successful because even before they actually started to fire their guns, the German troops had run away terrified because it was a foggy day when they were used, and these monsters, they said monsters, these monsters suddenly came out of the fog, and they'd never seen anything like it, this awful thing that was moving slowly but absolutely enormous with guns. The psychological effect was absolutely dramatic. The trouble was we didn't use enough. You know, it's all very, that's like being wise after the event. We thought we got enough, but we hadn't. More would have been very much more successful. They were very slow, they 4 miles an hour. And once the shock had worn off, the Germans found there were ways of dealing with tanks. As I say, you could put hand grenade in.
Pop a hand grenade.
Because they were so slow. But they did climb over the trenches. You've probably seen pictures of them lumbering along and crushing the barbed wire, being able to get into the enemy trenches. So the other thing that we all associate, I think, with the First World War is the use of gas. And this was regarded as a war crime by the Allies because it was the Germans that used gas for the first time. And that was seen as the most appalling thing, to use chemical warfare against human beings. Now we're sort of horribly used to it. But at the time, it was, it sort of hit the headlines in the most dreadful way that this was sort of the end of civilization as we know it. This appalling use of knowledge, human knowledge, to destroy somebody else's life. Even if they weren't killed, it would effectively destroy their life. And I know we had somebody on our little estate in Leeds. We didn't have a car, and we got public transport was excellent. So if he was on the bus, you could hear his awful ragged breathing and his coughing and his spluttering for years and years and years afterwards. He wasn't killed, but his lungs were so damaged that it was awful. I mean, just filled the bus over the engine. You could hear this awful rasping breathing. And when the bus stopped at the bus stop and it was quiet, you hear him almost like, well, fighting for breath, really.
Judy, the issue here is that it's quite close to us as a generation.
Yeah.
My own grandfather was gassed in the First World War, and he lost every hair on his body, and eyebrows, chest hair, everything, completely bald. And the story in the family is that he went to the cinema with his wife and he wore a cap because his head was bare. And the woman behind him told him off for wearing a cap indoors.
Oh.
And they stalked out of the cinema. And he spent the rest of his life as a bus driver because he could hide in the cab at the front and not take fares at the back.
That's sad.
Now that's a direct
It's a wonderful
carryover.
example. Yeah, thank you for that. That's a wonderful example. I think you'll all agree that people's lives were ruined, but they weren't killed. We tend to only think of when we say casualties, we think of the death toll.
I can remember his weeks. He had a week for Sunday and a week for the weekdays, and they lived on the sideboard on top of two vases.
Oh, I mean that's a sad but very compelling story of somebody's life being completely changed.
Ruined.
So the effect of the German, I mean, this just added to how people felt about the Germans. That they were barbaric, they'd forgotten they were Christians. It did seem like the end of civilization as people knew it, that this was a new, dreadful, barbaric use of technology, a misuse, an abuse of technology. So starting with chlorine gas and then mustard gas, and then we used it in retaliation. But Martin's found this wonderful photograph, which was later rendered as a painting, which you've probably seen. It's an enormous painting in the Imperial War Museum of the blinded men being led by somebody obviously with sight to a clearing station, so for treatment. And interestingly, Adolf Hitler, a young corporal in the German army, was gassed and blinded, not permanently, of course. He was lying in hospital when he was told, or they were told in the ward, about the ceasefire, about the armistice being signed. And in his book, Mein Kampf, his life story, his autobiography, he says how bitter and angry he was that he couldn't do anything. He was lying there helpless, wondering if he would get his sight back. And so angry that somehow his side had surrendered, and what a bitter humiliation it was, and how that happened, because when he had been gassed, the Germans thought they were winning. They were doing really well, they thought. And so it's interesting that Adolf Hitler was actually involved in this new dirty way of fighting, of dramatically ruining somebody's lungs. So the war dragged on, and we associate it with the war poets. The various governments, and particularly our government, went to great lengths to keep the truth from the British public, or the public, by saying, everything was going to be wonderful, and we were gaining victories, we were gaining land, we were gaining ground, even when it wasn't true. Or they would make it sound as though we'd gained miles of land and we'd gained a few yards. And the casualty figures weren't that they were published, but not the number of people who were damaged, physically damaged by the war. That was kept quiet. What a savage war it was in terms of damaging people's bodies. And the war poets, of course, were very honest. They couldn't be censored. And so gradually the war poets were making it clear that it was an ugly, vile war for all sorts of reasons. A lot of fake news. Passchendaele was one of, the Somme first, 1916, the Somme. We were going to win, it was all arranged, we were going to shell the German trenches. It wasn't just one battle, it was sort of along a very long front, 400 miles actually. The Battle of the Somme was a campaign rather than a battle. And we were going to win. We were going to shell for a whole week. We were going to bombard the German trenches. They would all either be dead, or they'd be mad, or they'd be deaf. They'd be deaf and blind and mad. They'd be, there was no way they could sustain a week of bombardment. And then, of course, the men were told to walk across no man's land. They couldn't get killed. They would just go, because the Germans all be dead. There wouldn't be anybody in the machine gun nest to machine gun them down. They would just walk across. They were told to walk, and lost more men then than ever before or since in one engagement, one day. And that resulted in conscription. We lost so many men that the British government decided they couldn't go back on enlistment anymore, because people were beginning to work out what it was like at the front, and they weren't enlisting. And so conscription was brought in between 18 and 50, interestingly, 50. Losses were so great. Passchendaele, interestingly named, Passchendaele was a sort of example, an exemplar of what the war was like. Photographs were taken of this devastated land, flooded, men trudging knee deep in mud, and if they fell down, they drowned in the mud. And that was Passchendaele became a sort of hideous example of how the war had developed into just trying to exist really in the conditions. Finally, the Germans surrendered, not because they were beaten militarily, a point they were very anxious to maintain. They were never beaten militarily. They were beaten through our blockade of their ports. So the Austrians and the Germans were starving, and the Hungarians were starving because we had blocked their ports. We weren't allowing any import of food. They were living on turnips. They were living on one meal a day if they were lucky. All the food, any food available, was sent to the army. So the civilians were actually starving, and eventually that's why they had to ask their armies to surrender. Known as the stab in the back. So November the 11th, 1918, ceasefire was declared, famous armistice day. The war was over, but rejoicing was very muted because people had realised that they'd been told a lot of lies by the government to keep morale high. And when the injured started to return home, men with missing limbs, men who were blind, men who were mad, the rejoicing was somewhat muted. So, results of the Great War. As you know, I expect, the Allies were determined that they were going to make Germany and Austria pay for what they were blamed for. They had started the war, which wasn't quite true. Great Peace Conference at Versailles in 1919, and it was savage. People were in a revenge, they were in a mood where they wanted revenge, they wanted to escape, they wanted to blame somebody for what had happened. So Germany was forced to admit responsibility for causing the war. This is unprecedented in history. You don't make another country totally responsible, even if they were. This is the sort of new idea. You've got to make them accept they were responsible, and they've got to sign a document saying, we caused the war, we are guilty. War guilt. Overseas, all her overseas colonies confiscated. The empire that Germany had been so proud of. East Africa, Far East, they had built up an empire, even though they come into the game late, but they managed to create an empire, very proud of it, all taken away from them and distributed between France and Britain. The great German army, the Prussian-based army that they'd been so proud of, this great, the military state, of course, Prussia, reduced to 100,000 soldiers, and she could no longer possess a navy or an air force. Again, this was absolutely savage. Huge swathes of German land were confiscated on top of all these other restrictions and humiliations, and ceded to other nations. The Sudetenland was given to a new country called Czechoslovakia. So 1919, the map of Europe was reconstituted. New boundaries drawn, new countries created. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were new countries. The Austrian Empire had collapsed, been on the wrong side in the war. The Turkish Empire collapsed, been on the wrong side in the war. So great empires that lasted hundreds and hundreds of years collapsed. And new boundaries, new countries, new frontiers. So the Sudetenland was given to Czechoslovakia. Other areas given to Poland. Alsace-Lorraine handed back to France. The Ruhr was now controlled by French troops. And then, again, as if that wasn't enough, enormous sums of money were demanded as reparations. Huge amounts of money. Germany was told she started the war, it was all her fault, the devastation in France, the fact that all this farmland was no longer available for farming. The French in particular were determined that Germany was going to pay back all that cost the French so much. They were going to pay. That was a new idea, comparatively new idea. Try and make the country pay for the damage they had done. Not sort of accept that both sides had done damage. No, it was all Germany's fault. So they had to pay for the devastated farmland and damage to cities and towns and trade routes, etc. It was all added up, and the Germans were forced to pay. And a peacekeeping force would be stationed in the Ruhr, which is the main German supplier of coal, iron, and steel. The Rhineland would be occupied by the winning side. Another humiliation for Germany. Total humiliation. Everything intended to humiliate Germany. Clemenceau, nicknamed the Tiger, was determined to make the Germans suffer. He loathed and hated the Germans, and he wanted to punish them. Lloyd George, who was our representative, Prime Minister, representative at the peace conference, hadn't actually had that attitude when he was speaking in this country, but when he went across to Versailles, he was somewhat influenced by Tiger Clemenceau, and he then used this phrase, "We'll squeeze Germany until the pips squeak." And that went down very well with the British press and with the British public, because we felt we had suffered and it was Germany's fault. Some delegates saw that this savage punishment was a mistake and said so, swept aside by the desire for vengeance, totally swept aside. We need to punish Germany. We need to punish her so much that she will never have any power ever again. She will become a minor state in Europe. That was the plan. Never cause any trouble again. We will diminish her, we will reduce her and keep her on her knees. And Martin found this famous Punch cartoon, which is, we used to pray for this to come up in the GCSE as a GCSE question, because we spent a lot of time, there's a picture of this in the textbook, explaining what this cartoon actually represents. And if it came up, it was a doddle of a question, because we'd spent so much time training our pupils to be able to answer the question. Famous cartoon, originally in the London Daily Herald and then later reproduced in Punch, because it became a talking point. It became sort of famous, we'd say today, trending. The peacekeepers, Clemenceau in the foreground, and then Woodrow Wilson, representing America, who came into the war late in 1917, but was there at the peace conference, of course. Orlando, representing Italy. And then very small in the background, people commented on this, Lloyd George, who really should have been near the front, near Clemenceau, should have been handed. And there's a pillar, and behind it, a toddler, well, a little boy, and it says, 1940 class, over his head. And the Tiger, Clemenceau, is saying to his companions, "Curious, I seem to hear a child weeping." Now, when you just look at it, you think, what on earth's that about? And then you think, 1940 class, child behind the pillar crying. So what it is saying is that this savage treatment of Germany is going to create another war, probably in about 20 years' time. Now, it's amazing. It's a prophecy, and it's accurate, because the war started in 1939. It didn't really get going until 1940. How amazingly prescient of the person who created this cartoon to say, in 20 years' time, we will be at war with Germany. Germany will get her revenge on the people who punished her so savagely in 1919. Germany will be resurgent. Amazing, absolutely amazing. Very famous. A wonderful cartoon. Curious, I seem to hear a child weeping. Class of 1940, meaning those children will be going to war. This child will have grown up and will be involved in another conflict. How amazing is that, to be able to predict so accurately? So, League of Nations, of course, something good came out of the war, the League of Nations. Very popular, very popular. There were League of Nations clubs, you could buy badges, it was amazingly popular. And of course, the war was described as the war to end wars, Armageddon, the war described in the book of Revelation in the Bible, the war to end wars, the final war, good against evil, never be war again. To us, that seemed so sort of naive and innocent, but you could understand. They just thought that there could never be another war. It was this one was so dreadful, it had taught everybody a lesson. Don't ever take up arms again. And then how to remember the dead. This was a new idea. Although the Boer War, there are war memorials commemorating the Boer War, but it wasn't a whole national thing. This was, first of all, a decision was made, a very unpopular decision actually at the time, that the men who had fallen in France and Flanders, the bodies would be buried where they fell. That was the expression used. They would be buried where they fell. They would not be brought back to this country, which had been traditional in previous wars. They'd be buried in great graveyards in northern France. And a special commission was set up. The British War Graves Commission was set up, still exists, of course. The dead would be buried and they'd have uniform gravestones. That was another very controversial. A lot of families say, well, I don't want gravestone to be the same as all the others. You know, we'll pay for an individual gravestone. No, you won't. They're all going to be the same. Well, they'll have different things written on them, but they will all look the same. Maintaining the idea that everyone had been in it together. And that officers and men died together and they would be buried together. And they would have the same gravestone. It's a very controversial but interesting decision. The beginning of the breakdown of the class system.
Pretty powerful.
Very powerful, yes. The cenotaph. Somewhere in London where people could go and mourn the dead. And Sir Edward Lutyens had been approached and he'd actually done a sketch on just a straight piece of paper. You know, very much just thinking on the spot. But it was actually approved and it was made of wood, painted to look like stone. For many years, it was made of wood, while people got used to the idea. Because a lot of it, again, very controversial, because it wasn't a cross. People, being a Christian country, people were used to using crosses for commemoration, in a commemorative way. But it was pointed out that our empire had come to the fought in the war, men from our empire who were not Christian. They were Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims, and therefore a cross did not represent their faith and therefore would be quite offensive and insulting. So the cenotaph was deliberately made to be so people couldn't object to it because it didn't represent a particular religious symbol of a particular faith. An empty tomb. Cenotaph means empty tomb, so it would be a bit like a headstone, and it would be white, and then it would show the wreaths to great effect. You know, red against white would show up. There were other suggestions, but Sir Edward Lutyens won through with his design. We'd say very controversial at the time because it seemed very modern and advanced, and people were quite sure why he'd chosen that particular shape. Then the Great Silence. That was what it was called. The 2-minute silence was originally called the Great Silence. It was a sort of play on words. It was the great silence that men heard when on the 11th of November 1918, when the guns fell silent, and many men found it so strange they couldn't cope with it. Some men actually had the nervous breakdown after the guns fell silent because they got so accustomed to hearing gunfire, hearing the exploding shells. And then suddenly it went quiet and they could hear birds singing. And somebody said, you know, it rattled them. They couldn't cope with it to start with, this enormous, powerful silence. But then the 2-minute silence was, they used that phrase, the Great Silence. 2 minutes on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and it's so wonderful and symbolic. And King George and his sons led the wreath laying ceremony at the cenotaph, wearing their uniforms. And that established the tradition, which of course had continued. Everything stopped. Everything stopped. Machines were switched off. It was quite amazing. Traffic stopped. Everything stopped, and there was silence, and you could just hear birds singing. And the king was very, very traditional, very sort of against anything new, and he was against all these ideas, and then he was persuaded, and he came round amazingly well, and then became very enthusiastic about the idea of this silence where people would remember the dead and honour the living, the ones who'd survived. Poppies were chosen, again, symbolic, because after the shelling, nobody thought that anything would ever grow again in areas like Passchendaele. It was just a sea of mud and dead animals and cordite and smelled horrible, smelled of chemicals because of all the shells that had exploded and all the horrible things that were going on. Things became, the mules and the horses were lying dead in the mud and going bad and just smelled vile. And the farmers were saying, well, nothing will ever grow here again. Absolutely nothing will ever grow. The land is poisoned. And then an amazing, like a miracle, poppies started to grow and flourished. And of course, it looked like blood. Red poppies, wild poppies, managing to grow, new life. It was just symbolic of life. Everything isn't over. Look at the poppies. They've survived, they're growing. And so the poppies were chosen as a symbol of remembrance and honouring the dead. And of course, it looked beautiful against the white of the cenotaph and the steps leading up to the cenotaph. Local war memorials in almost every community. Again, the government organised it. There was a committee that had to democratically agree to their design. And again, many villages chose a cross. Fair enough. Towns wasn't quite so appropriate. In Leeds, huge war memorial, which is the goddess of victory, a Greek goddess, huge, much bigger than life size, huge, holding a wreath, and there's a kneeling soldier. I mean, that was a bit controversial because that didn't represent everybody, but a kneeling soldier, and she's holding the wreath, which is bronze, over his head. He's kneeling with his rifle in his hands, he's praying, and she's giving him the wreath of victory. In Harrogate, where my parents moved from Leeds and went to live in Harrogate, a beautiful, simple war memorial, a garden, and then a simple obelisk, a bit like Cleopatra's Needle, a white obelisk. Again, it wasn't representing any particular faith, but it's very, very beautiful. And it's right in the middle of Harrogate. It's sort of a roundabout, and a good central position. So, and most of the memorials, there was a plinth, and the names were inscribed on the plinth, sometimes in rank order, and sometimes alphabetical order, which was much more democratic. Sometimes they did put the officers first, then other ranks, but sometimes it was in alphabetical order, which was better, fitted the new mood that the men had mixed, and a new form of democracy. The tomb of the unknown soldier, again, the king was very much against this. Let's leave it. People are forgetting about the war. Well, they weren't. People who received a telegram saying your son, your husband, whatever, missing in action. They waited for years hoping that they'd been taken prisoner of war and they would come home, and then eventually they realised that they were missing because their bodies had just been blown to smithereens and they'd lost their identity disc. They were left not able to come to terms with what had happened, what we now call closure, if there is such a thing, closure. These people just didn't know what had happened to their loved one. They knew what whereabouts they'd been fighting, but their body had never been found. So they had no grave. So the idea was mooted that they should choose one of the bodies that hadn't got an identity disc, a sort of an anonymous corpse, to represent all the people who hadn't got a known grave for people to visit. Not that many people could afford to visit, but they had the option. This would represent all these people who sort of disappeared and were lying somewhere, and then the families could think it was their son or husband or brother that was going to be honoured. He was going to be laid to rest in Westminster Abbey. So a beautiful concept. The king was against it. Oh no, people need to forget. We can't keep going on and sort of remembering the dead and being so morbid. And then he was won round, as usual. If he was told enough times about something, he was persuaded it was a great idea. Became very enthusiastic. And so there were 3 bodies, and somebody went and just chose one. And he was buried with huge military honours and royal honours, as if he was royal. Beautiful idea. Then the local war memorials, and the villages and towns were set up. Sometimes people say, well, we don't want to spend all the money on a memorial, a stone memorial with the names on. How about we build a village hall? That would benefit everybody. We still have the names up on a plaque somewhere. Or how about a garden? A peace garden, they're called, peace garden. There's one in Lichfield. Have a peace garden where people can go and sit, and again, the names will be presented. Or maybe a cricket ground, something again that would benefit the local people. You can still have plaques and so on.
Public collection, or?
Yes, people did contribute, but there was a sort of fund, and then yes, local people. I mean, a lovely idea to have a war memorial and a little garden. A lot of villages and towns did a kind of combination. And then immediately after the war, the results of the war, fashions changed very dramatically. Instead of long dresses never came back in after centuries of people wearing long dresses. They've been getting a little bit shorter during the war, but they were still just showing ankles, not whole legs. And then, amazingly, the men didn't go quite as wild as the women, but the men went a bit weird and started wearing funny wide trousers called Oxford bags. Not all men, obviously, but young men, young trendy men. Women went a bit mad, young women. Short, very short dresses, no corsets, no nipped-in waists, threw the corsets away, a kind of strange flat-chested kind of look, cut their hair very short, shingling it was called, cutting their hair really short, almost like a man, smoking, which had been absolutely, women must not smoke, only naughty ladies smoked, long cigarette holders, sort of showing off, look, I've got a cigarette. Amazing, showing all their legs and their arms, lots of bare flesh for the first time, absolutely outraging the older generation, absolutely outraging them. And they became known as flappers, and it was the jazz age. So there was a new way of dressing, makeup started to be worn, shock horror. Again, only naughty ladies had worn makeup. It was absolutely shocking I mean, if people wanted to look better, they just pinched their cheeks to look a bit pink and rub their lips so that a bit, their lips would go a bit red. But that was it. But these were kind of respectable young women that were wearing makeup and smoking and cut their hair off and showing their legs and their arms. And it got a bit wild. And then to add to the outrage, new kinds of music came along, jazz and the Charleston, where you sort of, drew attention to your legs by the way you were dancing. So this was a response, a wild kind of response to the horrors of the 1418 war. Very dramatic, and they say a kind of older generation in absolute shock. After the younger generation had gone mad. Nightclubs, dancing through the night. Just need to say that another result of the war, which was going back, is how popular the royal family became, because the king and queen had, well, the king had visited the front on many occasions. He was absolutely brilliant. And he could talk very, very naturally to all ranks because of his experience in the Navy. He really, really did well in the First World War. And the Queen assiduously visited hospitals and visited people who were very, very injured. I remember my mother telling me about, Queen Mary visiting somebody who was called the Eggman. He lost his arms and his legs. And everybody thought how brave the Queen was to go and talking to him, because other people had just shied away from, just even the medical staff were finding it very difficult to nurse him, to look after him, because he was so tragically injured. And the Queen, he could, and there were photographs of her with a very stiff face, fighting emotion, but managing to talk to him, and it meaning so much to him that it had this royal visitor. So the royal family really, really came good during the war. And of course, the king changed his family name. The Germans are so unpopular, he couldn't be called Saxe-Coburg-Gotha anymore, proper German name, Prince Albert's name. And after a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, what would they be called then if they weren't going to be given a German name? Windsor, ideal. Windsor, very English sounding, and representing one of their family homes. And they've been called Windsor ever since, of course. And Battenberg, they just changed it into an English Mount Batten. Berg is mount or mountain in German, so Mount Batten. And I didn't list all the others, but various other members of our royal family got German names, came up with another name. The king did live to celebrate the Silver Jubilee in 1935. By that time, the Christmas message, the Christmas broadcast had become popular. He was the first monarch, obviously the first monarch to do that. Very nervous to start with, didn't quite understand why it was important, but encouraged to do it. And then it became another reason for the king to be so popular, that he had spoken to his people, he'd spoken to the empire. People were listening all over the world, and that was something, that was what intrigued him, actually. That was what made him change his mind, that people all over the world would be listening. And he died really popular. He died knowing that he was popular because of 1935, the Silver Jubilee. He died knowing that storm clouds were gathering in Europe, obviously, and that fascism had taken over in Germany. He died of bronchial pneumonia on January the 20th, 1936. And you probably read somewhere, or you probably know, that his surgeon, Lord Dawson, actually murdered him, injected him straight into a vein with a mixture of, I forgot what one of them was morphine, I forgot what the other one was, and to put him out of his suffering. And also a very British snobbish thing, to catch the news to be in the morning papers. It wasn't appropriate for the king's death to be publicised in the evening papers, because they were common people bought the evening papers.
In the Times.
It had got to be in the morning papers, and posh people had their papers delivered to the house, and therefore that would be appropriate, but not just buying a copy of a paper, getting a paper from a news vendor in the streets and then reading about the king's death. That would not be appropriate. So Lord Dawson had, we don't know how near to death the king was, very, very near, but that only came out a few years ago, where Lord Dawson's papers, private papers, were investigated, and he'd actually written in his diary that that was what he was planning to do, put the king out of his suffering because he was struggling to breathe and probably in pain, and to catch the morning papers with the news of the king's death. So
on that happy note,
and of course we know what happened to his heir, and then our present Queen's father became king also in 1936. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy. So we bring to an end this series of lectures that seems to have been around for a while. we've come through the Tudors and the Edwardians and the Georgians and seen so many little insights into our funny ancestors, and often our very
You might have got funny ancestors, I haven't.
our ancestors that have got a lot of bottom, is the phrase that comes to mind, but I probably shouldn't say that as well. Judy, thank you ever so much for the work you put in. I know you say you enjoy it.
I do enjoy it, I love it.
But for us, it does add flesh to our own memories and our own thoughts of what's gone before. I look forward to the Saxons and the Romans, especially from a new perspective. And I look forward to having a hale and hearty Judy to join us again in September. So have a good summer, everyone. Thank you for your support. And
Thank you, Judy.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks for watching.
I will put out a note in the Sunday evening bulletin about our plans for September, so there may be others that want to join us as well. Thank you, everyone.
Lots of love.
Lovely.
Bye.
Take care. Thank you.